In June 2023, Labor released a draft law aimed at combating online misinformation.
Doing nothing is not an option in this space.
This caused outrage, especially from the Coalition, who said this.
Deputy Speaker, the government's misinformation bill is one of the most disturbing pieces of legislation ever put forward by an Australian government.
So let's look at the misinformation bill in detail. What the draft bill proposes to do is give more powers to the media regulator, the Australian Communications and Media Authority, or ACMA. These powers will apply to online content published on digital platforms like Facebook or YouTube. The draft law was released as part of a consultation process, where experts and members of the public were able to submit their feedback. And I want to make the point early that there's nothing wrong with consulting if the feedback is actually considered. But to understand the proposal in a bit more detail, I think it's important to have a look at how we got here. In 2019, the Australian government told digital platforms like social media companies to develop a voluntary code that would set out how they would deal with misinformation. A bunch of the main digital platforms created an industry association called Digi, and over the next year or so, they developed the voluntary code. This code covers the biggest tech companies in the world, like Apple, Google, Meta, TikTok, and a bunch of others. But since it's only a voluntary code, the way each company applies it is different. And sometimes, companies refuse to cooperate altogether. Very recently, Twitter, or now X, was kicked out of Digi for failing to cooperate with the association. Anyway, let's go back to when the voluntary code was just being released. Here is the then Coalition Communications Minister, Paul Fletcher.
Just on the disinformation code, so it was an ACCC recommendation that we develop a voluntary code, and the Australian Communications and Media Authority will report to governments by 30 June on the effectiveness of that code. If there's a need to use stronger powers, then we're certainly prepared to do that.
As he mentioned, ACMA did end up examining how the voluntary code had been implemented and reported back to government on its effectiveness. This is the 2021 report that formed the basis of the misinformation laws that we're now seeing proposed. In that report, ACMA said that the online propagation of misinformation was an increasing threat to Australia, and that the true scale and volume of misinformation is unknown, and that it leads to the erosion of trust in authoritative sources and democratic institutions. One of the case studies in the report looked at conspiracies around 5G networks and how this had led to an increase in vandalism of telecommunications infrastructure. In terms of how effective the voluntary code had been, ACMA said that good progress had been made, but that there wasn't much information available as to how successful measures against misinformation had been, and that there was a need for more consistency between digital platforms. In response to all this, ACMA made a number of recommendations, asking the government to increase its powers. So for example, Recommendation 3 asked for formal information gathering powers, allowing ACMA to get better data about how digital platforms respond to misinformation. Recommendation 4 asked for powers to be able to register and enforce mandatory industry standards in the event the voluntary code is deemed to be ineffective. This would allow ACMA to come up with its own code that digital platforms would then need to follow when dealing with misinformation. The Coalition sat on this report for almost a year, until March 2022, when Paul Fletcher published a detailed media release which agreed with all of ACMA's recommendations. The media release said that the Morrison government would introduce misinformation laws. They said they would give ACMA the new information gathering powers it asked for, and the new powers to create and enforce industry codes should voluntary efforts prove inadequate. This is all language consistent with the ACMA report and recommendations. Notably, I couldn't find any Liberal Party politician coming out against this proposal at the time. There was just no noise within the government. Remember this for later. The Coalition didn't end up introducing their legislation because they lost the 2022 federal election.
It's a night of disappointment for the Liberals and Nationals.
With Labor now in government, the Department of Communications approached the new Communications Minister, Michelle Rowland, and got her to agree to the same ACMA recommendations and the same way forward as the Coalition. We see all this in these departmental briefing documents released under FOI. Anyway, all this resulted in the Draft Misinformation Bill, which was released for consultation in June of 2023. So what does the bill actually do? As it's been proposed, the bill will give ACMA the power to gather information from digital platforms, and the ability to create and enforce a code of practice covering measures to combat misinformation online. Now, you've heard me say this a number of times already, but in practice, this means that ACMA can set the rules of how platforms deal with misinformation, and this will override the current voluntary code that's in place. This is a very broad power. And huge fines will apply to digital platforms if they ignore the regulator. The guidance released with the draft says that the powers would apply to a broad range of digital platform services, including search engines, social media, and web forums. But what the Misinformation Bill doesn't cover is equally important. For example, you may think that certain media organisations distribute a lot of misinformation, but professional news content is exempt from these powers. Another category exempt is content authorised by federal, state, or local governments, meaning whatever the government says online isn't caught by this bill. When the draft bill was released, it generated a lot of feedback, including thousands of submissions. But what I found interesting was that as soon as the draft was released, the coalition was howling away at how horrible this bill was.
We in the coalition will fight this legislation every step of the way. It strikes at the heart of our democratic rights, and it is an absolute disgrace.
A threat to the freedom of speech of every Australian.
This is a bad law. It must be stopped. Bin the bill.
Remember, these are the same people who said nothing when their own party proposed the same thing. And I think going through that history and seeing that both the Coalition and Labor have exactly the same policy on this is important, because it just shows that the opposition are a bunch of hypocrites who are trying to point score without offering anything of substance. The Coalition agreed to all of ACMA's recommendations. They agreed to bring in legislation with the same powers that are now being proposed. Yet they've done a 180 and are pretending to now be the heroes of free speech. But all this doesn't mean that the bill is great. In fact, there are valid concerns, which I want to run through. The Australian Human Rights Commission, for example, made a submission. They said that while there was a clear need to combat misinformation, there was a risk that doing it wrong would target different perspectives and opinions. They also said that distinguishing between truth and falsehood was not straightforward, and that there were dangers in allowing any one body to become the sole arbiter of truth. Now, the draft guidance that came with the bill goes to some length to point out that ACMA won't have the power to remove specific content. The government has also made this point clear.
This isn't about the regulator having any power to remove content or order the removal of content.
But the practical effect of the powers might result in content being removed anyway. The Law Council of Australia talks about these concerns in detail. They say that in practice, the draft bill may be overly incursive on freedom of expression. This can happen when digital platforms become overly careful in censoring content so they don't risk getting huge fines from ACMA. Another concern was that there was no general recognition that many topics of public interest involve genuine and legitimate factual disagreement, uncertainty, or debate. You can see how digital platforms would just not bother with the detail and just censor complete topics to avoid the headache of regulatory action. There was a bunch of other concerns, including vague information gathering powers that can be exercised against any person, including, it seems, you or I. The Law Council's conclusions was that the draft bill was overly broad, uncertain, and may have serious unintended consequences. Another submission was from Anne Toomey, a law professor whose submissions on government proposals I often read. She asked, how can a platform know with certainty what is misinformation? And what if it has a different view from the ACMA about what constitutes misinformation in a specific case? She called the draft bill half-baked, with serious risks, and said it would need a lot more work to make it acceptable. So now that the consultation period has ended, what happens next?
So we've engaged in an exposure draft to elicit views on how this should be crafted. And I'm grateful to everyone who has put forward thoughtful submissions in this area. We're looking at them very closely to ensure that we have the best balance between keeping Australians safe and any other concerns that may be arising. So we will take our time to ensure that that is done properly.
We've recently seen the media flagging that some changes will in fact be made from the feedback, but there's not a whole lot of information to go off. In the meantime, it's interesting to see the coalition making it seem like any amendment will be a humiliating backdown. It does make sense why they would say that though, because when they were in government, the idea of consulting and taking on feedback was completely foreign to them. It's a good time to remember the coalition's federal ICAC legislation, which they also released for consultation. Their proposal was a complete joke, designed to protect politicians, and they received over 300 submissions, many of them detailed criticism from experts. And the coalition ignored every single submission. Not a word was changed in their draft bill. Luckily, they got voted out, and Labor put in place a decent, but not perfect, federal anti-corruption body. If you want to go through a deep dive of that saga, I'll put a link to the series in the description below. Anyway, back to this draft misinformation bill. Misinformation is a problem. What's happening here is that the regulator wants more power. And that makes sense. All regulators, if given the chance, will want more power. And both major parties, Coalition and Labor, agreed to all of the regulators' recommendations, and we're going to release this kind of law. It's just that I suspect Labor will do a better job in responding to feedback. But putting aside the hypocritical coalition, we can't ignore the valid concerns from experts. My concern isn't so much that the Albanese government will try and crack down on political criticism. It's more about what happens when we get a really dodgy government in the future. Another Morrison government, for example. I also think that the average person looks at a misinformation bill and thinks that it will tackle misinformation coming from, say, Sky News, but they would be exempt from this. The real risk here is that online platforms will deal with this in the easiest way they can, and just shut down entire topics of discussion. And that will harm public debate, possibly more than the misinformation they're trying to combat. And as always, thanks for watching, and thank you to everyone on Patreon who is keeping this channel going. If you'd like to support me make more content, then I'll have a link to Patreon in the description.